Hello all, today I'm remaking a ring for a friend who often abuses his rings. Because he's rough on them, I'm basically using him as a guinea pig. The thing that I'm doing differently this time around is to use an epoxy paste to bond the wood to the metal core rather than my usual CA glue. The first few steps I'm taking in this process are to get the ring blank ready. The reason I'm making the cuts you see me making is that I drill the hole for the ring through the end grain of the wood. I think this makes the wood part of the ring a bit stronger and I like the look better as well. You might notice I'm cutting 2 blanks here, and that's because sometimes I'll have failures in the build process, and while I'm here cutting out the first blank, I might as well cut out a second one just in case. And in case it's not obvious, that little block above the block that I'm cutting, I'm using so that I don't have to have my fingers so close to the blade. After creating the blank, I need to drill the hole to accept the tungsten core. I don't feel very comfortable holding the ring blank with my fingers, so I use a baby clamp to hold it while I drill the hole. As you can see, I use a spade bit for this, but that's because I'm cheap and don't want to buy a whole new set of Forstner bits when the spade bit works fine. Once I poke through the blank with the spade bit, I flip the blank over and finish the hole from the other side. I do this because I've had the ring break on a few occasions when the bit goes all the way through in one direction. With the hole drilled in the blank, I move on to the most frustrating step, which is to ever so slightly expand the hole. To do this evenly, I wrap some sandpaper around a socket. When doing this, you need to be careful not to make the hole too big. There's a sweet spot where the ring can just barely fit in the blank without being beaten into place. If it has to be beaten into place, then it'll be more likely to break when the wood expands and contracts. If it fits too loose, there will be a big glue line and nobody wants that. Now that the hole is ready, I can prepare the epoxy paste. This is a 2-part epoxy and I'm adding in some black pigmentation so the glue line isn't noticeable. I don't normally use any coloring in the glue, but once the epoxy paste is completely mixed, it's a bluish white, so that's why I'm concerned about the glue line. To put the ring blank in the wood, I wrap some parchment paper around my ring mandrel, slather the paste on the blank, and then slip the blank onto the ring. The mandrel ended up being completely unnecessary this time, but sometimes after you get the glue on the wood, it creates extra friction or swells the wood or something rather than acting as a lubricator like it did this time. Once the epoxy paste cures, I still have a little work to do prior to putting it on the lathe. There are some voids and cracks in the wood that may cause it to explode when hitting the chisels, so I use some thin CA glue to fill those and hopefully further stabilize the wood. I do this on both sides, but there's no sense in making you watch the same thing twice. With the CA glue cured, I can toss the ring on the lathe to get it close to its final size. I don't do all of the turning right away because there's actually still some gunk on the inside of the ring core that's easier to remove once the wood is out of the way. I've used those expanding ring mandrels in the past and always had imperfect results, so I tried out this style and found that it's a huge improvement. The only issue is that depending on the ring size and bushing combination, it's tough to get close to the ring core with the chisels and the sandpaper. Since I first started making rings 6 or so years ago, I've learned that a sharp chisel makes a huge difference. Other than that, there's not a whole lot to talk about here. I'm just reducing the thickness of the ring by a lot and reducing the width by a little. With most of the wood removed, I take the ring to the oscillating belt sander to remove any excess wood from the edges. When doing this with a tungsten ring core like I am, it's important to not let the tungsten hit the sanding belt because it will make it useless very quick. It's important to note that doing this on the belt sander heats up the ring really quick, so you'll want to take frequent breaks if you're not using heat-resistant epoxy paste like I am. Because I don't want to destroy the belt on the belt sander, I get close with the belt sander and remove the rest of the material with a cheaper sanding disc. And to clean the gunk off the ring core, I use a little cylindrical rasp file thing. If this were any other metal, I would be a lot more careful throughout the process to keep epoxy and glue off of the ring core because removing it would be a much bigger hassle. With tungsten though, none of the tools I'm using will scratch it. With all the gunk cleaned off, I can throw the ring back on the lathe and get it down to its final shape. I'm no expert turner, so I don't have a ton of valuable input here other than to take it slow and check your measurements frequently. Fortunately, I've got enough experience now that I actually got down to the thickness I wanted fairly quickly without taking it too far. For the thickness of the ring, I found that about 2.5 millimeters is ideal after sanding. Another thing I want to mention is to take your time getting that nice rounded shape. What I found to be helpful with getting an even radius is to bevel each side since it's easier to create that bevel and then try to flow that into the center of the ring. Once I get the ring down to the shape and thickness I want, I lightly sand it on the lathe. However, if you only sand on the lathe, you're almost guaranteed to see sanding scratches in the final product since you're sanding against the grain. To try to address this, I do a lot of sanding off of the lathe. That being said, in my experience, that also isn't foolproof. Hopefully it yields good results this time though. The last couple steps are applying finish. I'm trying out tried and true original finish, which is really just boiled linseed oil and beeswax. However, the linseed oil is actually boiled instead of having chemical dryers added to it. To apply it, you just wipe it on, then thoroughly wipe it off after an hour. After a day, you can buff it and reapply. On this ring, I'm applying 3 coats, but since it's the same process, I'm just showing the one. The final step in the process is something I've started doing as a result of the abuse my friend puts his rings through. That final step is applying Blacktail Studios N3 Nano Coat finish. I do this in an attempt to make the finish of the ring more waterproof. The Nano Coat finish was made for larger items like gigantic tables, so the process is slightly different but essentially the same. The first thing to do is shake and apply the hard coat. On a gigantic table, it might be a rush to get the finish applied everywhere before it starts to cure, but on something tiny like this, it just takes a few seconds, so I simply continue to apply it for 30 seconds or so. After applying it for 30 seconds, you let it sit for about a minute and a half, then very lightly use a clean piece of the applicator cloth to absorb any excess. After absorbing the excess, you just gently buff it with a clean microfiber cloth. Like with the tried and true finish, I'm not showing you each coat, but I am putting on 3 coats of the hard coat with an hour between coats. After the hard coat, I waited 24 hours and did 3 coats of the top coat following the same steps, and that's it. Well, the ring turned out a bit darker than I hoped, so it was really hard to get pictures of, but I think it turned out pretty good for an experiment. Let me know what you think.